The Tennessee frontier in the early 1800s was a place where night meant something more than the absence of sun. It was a tangible weight. It pressed against the hand-hewn logs of the Bell farmhouse, a physical force that turned the surrounding woods into a wall of solid black. Inside, John and Lucy Bell lived by the rhythm of the seasons. Their world defined by the boundaries of their fields and the reach of their hearth fire. Beyond those flickering flames, the forest was absolute. Silence here was not empty. It was a presence that sat in the corners of the rooms, watching. It felt heavy, a thick stillness that seemed to draw the heat from the air. John Bell was a man of iron resolve, a builder who trusted only what he could measure and touch. But even he could not measure the pressure of the dark against his windows. It was a frontier of isolation, where the nearest neighbor was miles of dense timber away. No artificial light pierced that void. The house stood as a solitary island, held together by stubborn industry, while the shadows outside tightened their grip, waiting for the first crack in the foundation to appear. John Bell walked the perimeter of his fields, his boots crunching against the hard, frost-bitten earth. He monitored the fence line, looking for signs of encroaching brush. He stopped near the tree line, his eyes catching movement in the tall grass. It was not a wolf, nor a deer. It was a mass of shifting, distorted shadow that moved with a disjointed, unnatural gait. John gripped his lantern, the flame flickering as he stepped forward to intercept it. The shape did not run. It seemed to fold in on itself, dissolving into the brush before he could close the distance. He reached the spot, pushing aside the branches, but found nothing. No footprints in the mud. No broken twigs. The air here was wrong. It carried a sickly, biting cold that bypassed the skin and settled deep in the marrow of his bones. He stood for a moment, waiting for a sound, but the woods remained unnaturally still. He turned back toward the house, but the chill followed him, clinging to his skin like damp fog. When he stepped through the front door, the warmth of the fire felt thin and hollow, unable to purge the unnatural frost he had brought inside. The barrier had failed. The cold that John brought inside did not dissipate with the dawn. It took root in the rafters. The haunting moved from the fields into the bedrooms. It began in the dead of night. John and Lucy woke to the sound of coarse fabric sliding across wood. In the children's rooms, blankets were snatched from sleeping beds, pulled by invisible force toward the dark corners. The children woke to the sudden draft and the feeling of weightless hands brushing past their faces. The house became a maze of unseen movement. Throughout the night, the family lay rigid, listening to the rhythmic, heavy thud of pacing. Footsteps marched from the kitchen to the hall, back and forth, tireless and precise. Yet, the floorboards remained silent. No wood groaned under the pressure. No dust was disturbed. Every door in the farmhouse rattled against its frame as if pushed by a shoulder that was not there. The family stopped sleeping. They gathered in the main room, huddled near the hearth, watching the shadows for any flicker of motion. The sanctuary was gone. They were no longer the masters of their home. They were prisoners in their own rooms, waiting for the next violation of the air. The focus shifted from the house to the child. Betsy was the smallest, and the entity chose her as its primary target. It did not just move in the shadows, it reached out. One evening, as the family gathered for a meal, Betsy screamed. She clutched her throat, her face flushing as invisible fingers squeezed the air from her lungs. John rushed to her side, swinging his heavy lantern in a wide arc, but he struck only empty air. Then, the sound of a sharp slap echoed against the walls. A jagged red welt bloomed across Betsy's cheek, rising instantly against her skin. She collapsed, sobbing, while Lucy pulled her into a protective grip. But the entity did not retreat. It paced around them, a heavy, unseen weight that made the floorboards groan under nothing. Betsy woke in the night to the sensation of being dragged across the floor by her hair, her heels scraping against the boards. Her parents stood by, watching the impossible violence unfold, their hands trembling, their prayers silenced by the sound of a cruel, stifled chuckle. They were helpless. They watched the marks appear on her skin, one by one, a map of cruelty that turned their home into a torture chamber. The violence did not end, but it changed form. The bruising, the slapping, and the dragging stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a weight against the eardrums. Then, the first sound arrived, It was not a scrape or a thump. It was a whisper. It started low, a thin, sharp hiss that curled through the cracks in the wallboards. John leaned in, his jaw tight, his hand gripping the edge of the table. The whisper sharpened, gaining volume and clarity until it formed words. It was a woman's voice, articulate, cold and dripping with mockery. It called itself Kate. The entity began to sing. It chose old, mournful hymns, but the melody was twisted, notes sliding into discordant, jarring tones that made the family wince. Then, the voice turned its attention to the neighbors. It recited private conversations from the village, repeated secrets that no outsider could possibly know, and mocked the deepest shames of the people living miles away. The family sat in the dark, paralyzed. This was no longer just a haunting of the foundation. It was an intrusion into their very identity. Every secret they held, every whispered doubt, was now being broadcasted by the thing in the walls. The house had become a cage of exposure. The walls could not keep the secret. Word of the talking spirit leaked out, traveling from the farm to the village and beyond. Within days, the road to the Bell House was choked with horses and wagons. Curious men and women arrived in droves, seeking to witness the impossible with their own eyes. They crowded the yard, pressing against the windows. Inside, the family had no sanctuary. The entity thrived on the intrusion. It abandoned its hiding spots, projecting its voice to the rafters to ensure every spectator heard. When a skeptic dared to challenge its presence, the voice lashed out, reciting the man's hidden failures with surgical precision, leaving him trembling before the jeering crowd. The performance was relentless. Kate sang, mocked, and answered questions, her voice booming through the farmhouse as if it belonged to the very air. The family huddled in the corner of their own kitchen, watching as their private agony became a macabre carnival. Every gasp from the crowd and every shout of amazement fed the thing. It grew louder, more confident, and more demanding. The house was no longer a home, it was a stage for the entity to cement its name across the territory. The crowd eventually drifted away, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was hungry. The entity stopped projecting to the rafters. It pulled its focus inward, narrowing its malice until the entire house seemed to tilt toward one man. John Bell sat by the hearth, trying to focus on a book, but his hand began to jerk. He tried to grip the arm of his chair, but his fingers would not obey. A tremor started in his jaw, pulling the muscles tight until his face contorted into a jagged, unnatural mask. He dropped the book. His breath came in shallow, ragged hitches. He tried to stand, but his knees buckled, slamming against the floorboards with a dull thud. His eyes darted to the empty corners of the room. The air around him grew heavy, vibrating with a low, static hum that made his teeth ache. He reached for the table to pull himself up, but his arms spasmed, knocking a pitcher to the floor. It shattered. He stared at the shards, unable to speak, his face twitching rhythmically. The haunting had ended. The hunt had begun. He was no longer just a witness to a spirit, he was a target in a war he could not fight. The house groaned under a weight that had no source. John lay on the floor, his face fixed in a grimace of involuntary muscle spasms. Then, the walls began to vibrate. It was not a sound of wood settling. It was a rhythmic, rasping whisper that seemed to emanate from the very grain of the timber. "Your time is short, John," the voice rasped, cold and precise. It did not boom for the crowd anymore. It was intimate, a serrated blade of sound directed solely at the man on the floor. Lucy knelt beside him, pressing her palms against his shoulders to stop the shaking, but the air around them turned glacial. The entity laughed, a disjointed, rattling sound that echoed through the joists. It recited the hours left in his life, mocking his inability to rise. Every word felt like a physical blow, sapping the remaining warmth from the room. John clawed at the floor, his fingernails scraping against the planks, but his body remained unresponsive. The family could only watch. They were prisoners in their own home, witnessing the slow, calculated erosion of the man they loved. The voice promised the end, and with every passing minute, the house grew colder, darker, and more hollow. There was no escape from the sound. Winter of 1820. The air in the room hung stagnant, thick with the smell of damp earth and slow decay. John Bell lay on the bed, his chest rising in shallow, erratic bursts. He was a shell of the man he had been, his skin pale and stretched tight over bone. Then, a sharp click sounded on the wood of the nightstand. Lucy turned her head. A small dark vial sat there, untouched a moment before. It was stoppered with a heavy, blackened resin. A thin, acrid vapor leaked from the rim, smelling of rot and bitter herbs. "Drink it, John," the voice drifted from the shadows in the corner, mocking and triumphant. "It is the final medicine for your long, long suffering." The family recoiled, yet they could not look away from the glass. The vial seemed to pulse with a low, rhythmic light. John's eyes flickered, fixed on the container, his breath catching in a dry, painful rattle. He knew what it was. The entity had stopped whispering. It was now boasting, a cold, jagged sound that filled the room. The house went deathly quiet, save for the hum of the poison, as the realization solidified. This was the end of the line. John's hand twitched one last time, brushing the rough wool of the quilt, then went still. The ragged rattle in his chest smoothed into a final, heavy silence. Lucy reached out, her fingers pressing into his neck, but there was no pulse. The room felt suddenly hollow, as if the air had been sucked out through the floorboards. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No scratching, no whispers, no movement. Then, the house erupted. A sound tore through the walls. Not a voice, but a primal, jagged roar of victory that shook the very foundation of the home. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malice. It echoed off the rafters, vibrating the glass in the windows until they rattled in their frames. The entity had wanted this moment for years, and now it claimed it. The roar shifted, twisting into a sharp, piercing shriek of triumph that seemed to fill every corner of the farmhouse. It was the sound of a promise kept. It was the sound of a life extinguished. The family huddled together as the noise overwhelmed their senses, leaving no space for grief, only the crushing reality of the entity's power over them. The master of the house was gone, and the intruder had finally won. The funeral was a somber affair, held under a grey, pressing sky. Mud clung to the boots of the mourners as they gathered near the open grave. Lucy stood at the edge, her head bowed. While the wind pulled at the dry grass, no one spoke. The weight of the loss was absolute, a heavy stillness that seemed to honor the man who had been taken. Then, the air shifted. A low, vibrating hum began to rise from the very ground beneath their feet. It was not the wind. It was a voice, a sharp, melodic, and hideously jubilant song cut through the solemnity of the service. It was Kate. She did not hide in the shadows of the trees. She sang from the air above the casket, her voice twisting into dissonant, mocking harmonies that danced over the heads of the grieving family. She laughed between verses, a sound like dry leaves skittering on stone. The mourners froze. They looked up, searching the empty space, their faces pale and drawn with an unshakable terror. The entity was not finished. It was performing, reveling in the public spectacle of their agony. The song grew louder, more insistent, stripping away the dignity of the burial and replacing it with a cruel, mocking celebration of the end. The song stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was heavier than the grief. A voice rippled through the clearing, clear and chillingly articulate, vibrating in the chests of every person standing by the grave. "I am moving on," it whispered, the words carrying the weight of a physical blow. "But I have left my mark." The entity retreated, not into the woods, but into the very structure of the farmhouse. It saturated the logs, the floorboards, and the walls with a lingering acidic malice that would never truly dissipate. The home was no longer a place of shelter. It was a monument to the violence that had unfolded within. As the family turned away, the entity issued its final decree. The voice promised to leave for now, but it vowed to return. It was a promise anchored in time, a threat that hung in the air like smoke. The farmhouse remained, a hollow shell of timber and shadow, forever tethered to an invisible weight. The entity had claimed its victory, yet it made clear that this was merely a pause in its cycle of torment. The threat was not buried with the dead, it was waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The legend does not end with the timber and the soil. The entity does not require a farmhouse to survive. It only needs a listener. By hearing the name, By knowing the secrets, you have opened the door. The voice is no longer trapped in the walls of the past. It is here, in the quiet of your room, waiting for the silence to break. You are the new host. Listen closely.